Lucy stood at the entrance of the room, watching James with a mix of curiosity and caution. He was no longer the boy she had known years ago when she was still dating John. Now he was a grown man, with an easy smile and a presence that filled the house with an unexpected energy. John's business trip would take him away for a week, and he had insisted that James stay with Lucy. "So you don't feel lonely," he had said, unaware of anything. Lucy had accepted the invitation, though reluctantly. There was something about James that made her uneasy. He was sitting on the sofa, casually flipping through a magazine, but his eyes sparkled whenever they met hers. A quick, fleeting glance, but deep enough to stir a new sensation in Lucy, one she hadn't felt in a long time. There had been an emotional distance between her and John in recent months, a lack of connection that seemed increasingly hard to ignore. Yet she had never considered another man, until now. "You seem different, James," Lucy said, sitting on the other side of the sofa. "More mature." James smiled, not taking his eyes off the magazine. His smile had a subtle kind of insolence, a hint of confidence that didn't match the image of the young man she had known. He looked at her, this time with more intensity. "Time does that to us, doesn't it?" he replied, his voice calm but laden with subtext. "And you've changed too, Lucy. You're more beautiful." She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, as if she was being looked at differently for the first time in years. John had always been kind, but his affectionate words had become so rare that they seemed part of a hollow routine. James's words, on the other hand, were full of meaning, as if he saw something in her that even John no longer noticed. Night fell, and the conversation between them flowed easily, shifting from small talk to old memories and eventually to something deeper. Lucy found herself laughing, forgetting her initial reservation as the atmosphere around them changed. The soft crackle of the fireplace filled the space, the warmth gradually increasing, as did the tension in the air. When James leaned over to grab the remote, his fingers brushed against Lucy's. The touch was brief, but enough to send an electric shock through her body. She pulled away slightly, surprised by her own body's reaction. James, however, didn't seem disturbed. He merely gave a half smile, that enigmatic smile that made her acutely aware of his presence. By the end of the night, when Lucy said goodbye to him in the hallway, she felt that something had changed irrevocably. James hugged her briefly, but she felt the warmth of his body pressed against hers for a second longer than necessary. And then, when he pulled away, his eyes remained locked on hers. "Good night, Lucy," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She didn't respond, just watched as he disappeared down the hallway toward the guest room. Lucy's heart raced more than it should have, and she hated herself for it. But as she walked back to her own room, she knew that James's gaze wouldn't leave her mind anytime soon. The next morning, Lucy woke up feeling as if the previous night had been a strange dream, a brief lapse in reality. But as she descended the stairs and found James making coffee, the weight of the night before hit her hard. He was in the kitchen, his back to her, moving with ease and familiarity, as if he already belonged in that space. She watched him for a moment, her gaze fixed on his broad shoulders, on the way he moved around the stove, and the unsettling feeling that something was changing within her returned. "Did you sleep well?" James asked, turning to her with a cup of coffee in hand. The smile was still there, but now there was something deliberate, almost provocative in his gestures. Lucy nodded, sitting down at the table. There was a silent tension between them, as if both were aware of what was forming but neither dared to name it. Breakfast was marked by trivial conversation, but the long pauses between words were loaded with unspoken thoughts. As the afternoon wore on, Lucy found herself increasingly lost in her own thoughts. The house was quiet, except for the soft sounds coming from the garden where James was now working. The distant noise of gardening tools, the rustling of leaves in the wind, everything seemed part of an illusory tranquility. She caught herself watching him through the window, his movements fluid and controlled, the way his body moved with a confidence that was both attractive and unsettling. "This is insane," Lucy thought, pressing her hands against the kitchen counter. She shouldn't be feeling this way. James was her husband's nephew. Common sense screamed for her to step away from this dangerous proximity, but a deep, repressed part of her soul seemed unwilling to listen. By the late afternoon, Lucy approached the garden door, calling James inside with some excuse about dinner. He came, his face sweaty, his arms covered in dust, but with a smile that made something inside her stir. The conversation was light, but the tension grew. Each glance, each small touch intensified the repressed desire between them, until on a quiet night, alone, in the garden illuminated by the soft light of the moon, Lucy gave in to the impulse that was consuming her. The late afternoon sky was tinged with a soft orange when Lucy called James inside. The garden air had a fresh scent of wet grass mixed with the perfume of the flowers she had planted months earlier. James walked slowly toward her, his body still damp with sweat and covered with a light layer of dust. His smile was easy, almost innocent, but there was something in his eyes that disturbed Lucy deeply. "The dinner is almost ready," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought you might want to take a shower first." "Sure, but I think you might help me pick out something appropriate for dinner," he replied with a playful tone, but the smile that followed carried a heavier weight. The subtle teasing seemed filled with ulterior motives, and Lucy found herself laughing nervously, trying to ignore the heat rising in her face. He brushed past her, and the slight brush of his shoulder was enough to make her heart race. It was an innocent proximity, but charged with a tension on the verge of exploding. Lucy watched him as he climbed the stairs, and for the first time in a long while, she felt her body respond to a desire that had long been dormant. During dinner, they chatted casually, but Lucy could barely focus on the words. Every time James smiled or moved his hands to gesture, she felt mesmerized by him. His words were ordinary, but his presence made every detail around them more intense. The clinking of cutlery, the muted sound of his steps, the subtle aroma of the food. Everything blended into a symphony of sensations that enveloped her completely. "You've been quiet, Lucy," James remarked, his voice low and laden with something Lucy couldn't immediately identify. "Is everything okay?" She looked at him, and the intense gaze she found in his eyes made her turn her face away, embarrassed by the vulnerability beginning to form between them. "Yeah, I'm just tired, I guess," she lied, trying to hide the internal storm that was boiling inside her. But James wasn't convinced. "You know you can tell me," he said, his voice soft and too close, his fingers lightly touching hers across the table. The touch, though brief, made Lucy's heart race. She stood up abruptly, clearing the plates and moving away from him, trying to put distance between her own feelings and the dangerous closeness of James. But the truth was undeniable. Something was forming between them, and although she tried to convince herself it was just an illusion, she knew deep down that desire was growing with each glance, each casual touch. That night, the house was in complete silence. The sound of the wind beating against the windows and the gentle murmur of the leaves rustling outside were the only noises filling the void. Lucy tried to focus on reading a book, but the words blurred as her mind wandered back to James, who was sleeping in the guest room at the end of the hall. She got up, restless. The heat of her body seemed to find no relief. Each step she took through the house seemed to echo, as if the very structure of the house were aware of the internal battle she was fighting. She paused in front of James's door, unsure whether to knock but also unable to pull away. What was happening to her? Since when had her life become a plot of repressed desires and silent betrayals? She thought of John, the husband who trusted her blindly, and a pang of guilt tore at her chest. But at the same time, there was a hunger inside her that refused to be silenced. Before she could decide what to do, the door opened. James was there, standing, his eyes tired but awake with something more. They didn't say anything. Words were unnecessary at that moment. It was as if both knew what was about to happen, and neither was willing to fight against it. James took a step back, allowing Lucy to enter the room. The atmosphere was charged, the electricity between them palpable. He slowly pulled her close, and the warmth of their bodies fused in an embrace that was not only physical but deeply emotional. The kiss that followed was soft at first, filled with hesitation and fear, but soon turned into something more, something that had been quietly building over the past few days. James's hands explored Lucy's body with an almost reverent devotion, while she surrendered to the moment of weakness, ignoring the consequences that would follow. The betrayal was sealed with a sigh of relief and despair, a fusion of desire and guilt that neither of them could contain any longer. When they finally pulled apart, both were silent. The house, which had previously seemed so full of unspoken tensions, was now enveloped in a strange calm. Lucy knew that nothing would be as it was before. She couldn't undo what had just happened, and deep down, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. In the days that followed, Lucy found herself trapped in a web of conflicting emotions. The feeling of guilt consumed her, yet the desire for James continued to grow. Each secret meeting they shared, each covert touch, only heightened the intensity of their connection. She tried to ignore John's watchful gaze, but felt that with each passing day, he grew more suspicious, as if something invisible was breaking between them. The tension was becoming unbearable. Lucy spent hours lost in thought, questioning her own choices and the dangerous path she had taken. The mere sound of James's voice made her shiver, while John's presence began to feel like an unbearable burden. Lucy knew she couldn't continue like this, but the idea of ending what had begun with James seemed even more impossible. The tension among the three was evident. John watched Lucy more closely, his eyes carrying a mix of doubt and suspicion that she couldn't avoid. James, on the other hand, remained distant during the day, but his furtive glances and occasional touches continued to stoke the fire that consumed Lucy. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything would explode. One night, while silence filled the house, Lucy lay beside John, but her heart and mind were with James. Nights with him were an escape, a place where she allowed herself to be who she truly was, free from the expectations of being a perfect wife. But now, every time she looked at John, she saw the shadow of her betrayal and the inevitable confrontation that was coming. "You've been different." John broke the silence, his voice low but carrying something Lucy feared. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Lucy remained still, feeling the weight of guilt build in her chest. She had always been good at masking her emotions, but John had known her for years. He was sensitive to the subtle changes in her behavior, and she knew she was walking a fine line. "There's nothing," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant, but her voice wavered, and she realized he noticed. John sat on the bed, watching her for what felt like an eternity. Lucy avoided his gaze, her heart racing as if she were on the edge of a cliff. It was as if a ticking time bomb was about to explode, and every word, every gesture, only hastened the inevitable. "It's James, isn't it?" John's words came out like a sharp blade, slicing through the air between them. Lucy felt the blood drain from her face. There was no turning back. What she had feared for so long was now laid bare before her, forcing her to confront the truth. She opened her mouth to deny it, to say anything that might relieve the tension, but nothing came out. The words were stuck, choked by the weight of the guilt that was crushing her. John stood up, and Lucy saw the controlled anger in his eyes. It wasn't the explosive kind of anger, but rather a silent, cold, and calculated fury, making it even more terrifying. "I knew," he said, his voice low and firm. "From the moment he arrived, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to believe you would be capable of this." Lucy felt tears well up, but they did not fall. Her throat was dry, and the words she so desperately wanted to say remained trapped. She wanted to apologize, explain, justify, but everything seemed futile in the face of John's disappointed gaze. He left the room without looking back, leaving Lucy alone in unbearable silence. The weight of the betrayal fell upon her with an intensity she had never anticipated, and the guilt that had once been silent now screamed inside her. The days following the revelation were a blur for Lucy. John was absent, both physically and emotionally, leaving an unbearable emptiness in the house. James, sensing that something had changed, kept his distance, as if he knew his role in this drama was nearing its end. Lucy spent hours in silence, reflecting on the choices that had led her to this point. The desire that had consumed her for so long now seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the reality of the consequences. The betrayal was not just a matter of carnal desire. It was a profound rupture in everything she believed she was. John didn't speak much to her, but his prolonged absences and the cutting silence were enough for her to know that he was processing everything painfully. Distrust had settled between them, slowly eroding their relationship like a poison spreading silently. One night, after days of silence, John finally broke the ice. "I don't know what we'll do from here," he said, not looking at her, his voice heavy with deep sadness. "But I need time. I need space." Lucy felt her chest tighten. She knew this meant the end of something, even if it wasn't the definitive end of their marriage. There was now a distance between them that might never be bridged. And what about James? She knew that, too, couldn't continue. What had been a burning passion had become a source of destruction, and she could no longer deny the damage she had caused. That same night, Lucy went to the guest room where James was packing his bags. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the same pain and regret she felt. "It's over, isn't it?" he asked, his voice low and sorrowful. Lucy nodded, unable to respond with words. The silence between them was thick, filled with everything that had gone unsaid, but they both knew it was the only possible path forward. James approached her, his fingers brushing against hers in a final gesture of farewell. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said, his voice carrying a resignation that Lucy felt mirrored her own feelings. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears. The end of this chapter was painful but necessary. She knew the scars she would carry would be deep, and the future, now uncertain, would depend on how she and John could handle the pain that surrounded them. The next morning, James left, and the silence that remained in the house seemed even more profound. Lucy stood at the door, watching as he disappeared into the distance, and a sense of emptiness overtook her. She had lost far more than she had gained, and now she would have to face the consequences of her choices. The future with John was uncertain. Perhaps they could rebuild something, perhaps not. But Lucy knew that, regardless of what happened, she would never be the same.